Hello everyone, welcome back to my lecture. So in our previous class we talked about production function, production and producers behavior. In the production function we also have discussed about what is the how productivity curve looks like with one variable proportion, and we also have discussed about the choices between labor and capital if both the factors of productions like labor and capital are variable, and options for the producers. So in that context we also discussed optimization conditions, like where MRTS will be equals to marginal productivity of labor by marginal productivity of capital, which will be equals to W by I, which is price of labor and price of capital, that particular ratio. So now today we'll discuss about relationship between total cost, because cost function is a constraint, and whether it is firm or the government, when they decide to produce certain goods and services, cost is the main component that needs to be taken into account. So when we talk about total cost, we really need to understand a couple of other factors and important components. So now, like say total revenue curve, like if we try to understand total profit, if we measure, as we know that we measure profit by pi, and pi is nothing, is like total revenue minus total cost, and total revenue we know is like P and Q. P is the price per unit and Q is the total quantity, so it's P, Q is like total value of the product, and then we know the total cost. So this is how it looks like. So what is total cost? So total cost, the same logic with two variables like labor and capital, and then total cost is divided into total fixed cost and total variable cost. So what is total fixed cost? As we already know that couple of cost at the time of production, those are fixed for firm, and some of the variables like labor and capital are the variable cost for the for the firm, and those are total variable cost. So what is total average cost, or average total cost, or average fixed cost and average variable cost? Is nothing, it is basically total cost divided by total quantity will be equals to total fixed cost divided by quantity plus total variable cost divided by quantity. Likewise we get nothing, is like average total cost equals to average fixed cost and average variable cost. So now let's talk about what is marginal cost. So marginal cost is nothing, is like change in the total cost due to one unit quantity. So what is if firm decides to produce one extra amount of one commodity, then firm also has to understand first is like what will be the changes in the total cost due to one unit changes in the total quantity. So this is marginal cost. Marginal productivity or marginal product is like similar, I mean in our last class also we discussed. Here again I'm reiterating, like MP is like change in total productivity due to changes in the quantity. So when a firm tries to produce additional or extra amount of commodity, firm needs to calculate total marginal productivity and also marginal cost. So and we already discussed about the law of variable proportions with one and then with the two variables also. So now let us draw how it looks like, and also we'll talk about how firm's supply curve looks like, and then from there we will talk about from individual to, or here individual is basically firm supply curve to the market supply curve. Like suppose here say we have taken two panels. So say here panel 1 and here say panel 2, and say here total cost, total variable cost and total fixed cost on the vertical axis in the panel 2, and here say output on the horizontal axis. In panel 2, horizontal axis is output, and on the vertical axis we will come back here. So this is our total fixed cost, which is fixed for every production. And then here, like say this is a total variable cost. So here is a 0. So of course, even in the 0 output, a firm has to say needs to spend some amount which can be regarded as total fixed cost. As output increases here, then variable cost start increasing and fixed cost is fixed at one certain level. Like say here fee F is a fixed cost for firm for all the output for so now total cost is summation of average total fixed cost and total variable cost, and then this curve will move parallelly to total variable cost, and this gap between TC and TVC is due to TFC, the same amount here. So now in the panel 2 we will draw all other like total variable cost. It will be like average fixed cost line, because TFC is a fixed divided by say total level of quantity. So it is like downward sloping, but it will never be 0, it is asymptotic. And here is like average variable cost, and here average cost, and then as we know this is like marginal cost. And we are not discussing about this point because you already know, I suppose that first average variable cost will reach at the minimum, and then average cost will be reaching at its minimum, and marginal cost first decreases and then reaches at minimum point, and then it start increasing, and it will touch all the minimum point, like two minimum point. One is like average variable cost, and then it will also cut minimum point of average cost. So this point where marginal cost curve is cutting the minimum point of average variable cost. So this point is called shutdown point for the firm. So before this, below point, say here below at this point, say S, and say this is S dash. So below S, firm can't even recover average variable cost, and therefore any point above this point, average variable cost, will be the firm's supply curve. So so here, this is how supply curve is upward sloping. Here if we measure average variable cost, average fixed cost and average cost, and this is how we get supply curve for the farm, which is upward sloping for at the farm level. And we are also not discussing about what is the relationship this price and output in case of perfectly competitive farms. So here we are just simply trying to in this particular lecture we are simply trying to understand the reason for farms supply curve which is upward sloping. So now let's move to supply curve. So supply curve, here we are talking about market supply curve, is basically it shows the relationship between price of goods and services and then quantity supplied by the producers at any given point of time, keeping all other things constant. So the functional relationship between the price of a good or services and the quantity supplied by the producers. So this is represented by the supply curve. So the supply curve shows again of a good a farm is willing to produce, and that's why we have discussed about the shutdown point, because below that shutdown point farm will incur losses, and therefore it is not viable for producers, or producers will not be encouraged to produce goods and services. And therefore the point, supply curve shows all the points on which a farm is willing to produce at each price. Is basically farm is willing to produce more as the price increases, because producers, just like consumer, producers are also rational, and rationality assumption or rationality principles of economics will also be applied in case of producers behaviors and in case of supply curve. And therefore as price increases, producers will be highly motivated to produce. Unlike demand function, as price increases, demand for quantity demanded will be decreasing, but then in case of supply curve, as price increases, producers will be producing more. So if we draw this and we are directly coming to the functional relationship between the price and then here say QX, but then this is of course the supply side stories for the farm, for the market. So here supply curve will be upward sloping, where like at P1 amount farm will produce or producer will produce X1 amount of commodity. As price increases, it will be motivating factor for producers, and producer will produce more as price increases. As price increases further, producer will further produce more. So this is how all the points that we are getting it here, like say A, B and C. So this is basically the upward sloping supply curve. So now farms versus market supply. At the point where marginal cost curve of the farm is cutting the average variable cost, that point onwards is the farm supply curve. So that particular portion of the supply marginal cost curve will be farms or individuals supply curve. And here when we plot quantity along with price, then we'll get the market supply curve, which is again shows the positive functional relationship between price and quantity. Let's see what are changes in the quantity supply and changes in supply. So the way we had shown in case of demand, here also like Px for the commodity X, and here like X, and this is supply curve. So any point, like say if point moving from A to B, it is basically changes in quantity supplied, like say X1 to X2 and here P1 to P2. So if X becomes expensive, or price that we get it for X is increasing, then for producers will tend to produce more. So it is basically internally, price and quantity supplies are related. And like suppose Px and X here, and here say supply curve 1, and suppose new technology arrived in the production, and therefore supply curve altogether will change from S1 to S2, or say input prices had reduced, and therefore supply for that particular commodity will be reduced, or any economic shock happens, and then producer decides to reduce the total quantity for the supply, and then it will move leftward like S3. So this is this is how changes in supply curve, it moves rightward and leftward. So now let's see what are the probable factors influencing total supply function. So first is state of technology, that just now we had given the example, like state of technology or the body of knowledge about how to combine inputs of production, and that will have the impact on the supply functions. Input prices, like if minimum wages increases by the government, then that will also impact on the supply curve at the farm level, because labor will become expensive, and some strategy at the farm level by the producers will be there. Or say rate of interest increases by the monetary policy, and then that also will impact at the farm level while using the total capital. So these are because of the input prices, or any changes happens in the input prices. Then price of goods related in productions, like say land, rent, if rent has increased, or other crop prices are increasing, so that also will impact on the farms or producers supply curve. So now to continue with future expectations, for instance, like if producers are thinking like in particular commodity will have much more demand and will get higher price in future, in that anticipation, if at the current price, if a farm is supplying more, that expectation on the future price also will be determining factor for the producers for supplying that particular goods. So now number of producers, for instance, if one particular product is produced by one producers, but then the same product, if there are many other, like one or two additional producers are also coming in the market, then certainly competition will be there, and then first farms supplying the goods and services will also be changing. So number of producers will have certain impact on the supply curve. And government rules and regulations, like if government introduces taxes or subsidies on the input price, like for instance on the crop subsidies, or say government increases the minimum wages, then of course this will have the impact on the supply curve. So different other externalities, like cost of other factors, which has no direct relations, but then certainly it will have factors influencing the supply. For instance, fiscal capacity, like tax revenues, borrowing, and resource availability for the for overall economy, that government has a role to play. Or any policies that you can consider, like when government decides to either introduce more welfare oriented policies or market oriented policies, or using combination of welfare oriented or market oriented. Let's take the example of say MSME, subsidy on MSMEs. Of course it has multi layers from the policy perspective. Like one is of course introducing or promoting more domestically produced goods and services, at the same time also to accommodate casual or unskilled or semi-skilled workforce more, and making more labor surplus sector, so that a lot of unemployment or unemployed workforce can be accommodated. Another one example could be financial inclusion programs, where people are encouraged to save in the bank, and then those money will be circulated and will be used for overall goods and overall supplying goods and services in the economy. Then technology also plays very important role, and in public policy, that is like now in the present time, especially from 2010 onwards, then we have seen that entire governance structure has been shifting, and then like for example take the example of say Aadhaar. So technology enables new forms of governance, and then make much more efficient production, and then in case of supplying goods and services, whether it is PDA system or supplying say link for the job card under Manrega. So these are like in case of efficiency, that supply function can be derived in case of public policy. So these examples will be further taken into account when we discuss more. So now how market mechanism happens, like take the let's see how in case of product any goods and services, how demand and supply they interact. So as we know that demand is downward sloping, we are not reiterating price, say here say commodity X. So this is, if this is a market for commodity X, and X could be anything, could be food or say clothes or any other commodity that you can imagine. On the vertical axis price, and then horizontal axis is quantity demanded or demand, in case of quantity demanded in case of demand function, and quantity supplied in case of supply curve. So here upward sloping supply curve and downward sloping demand curve, and then this is called equilibrium point, say point E, and then here say point A to B. So this is excess supply, where supply is more than demand, and here say point C and D. So here more demand than supply is the excess demand. So there is a kind of shortage, and here is the surplus. So in this case, the excess supply is basically the surplus, excess demand is basically the shortage. So this is like equilibrium amount of price, and here equilibrium level of quantity. So this is how market interact with each other, where demand and supply of any commodity, they intersect to each other. So now let's move to next, like what happens when demand changes, right? Any change that happens in the demand, like here D1 and Px, and here Qx, and suppose, and this is initial supply curve, and then for certain reason, say demand for that particular commodity has increased, and then demand curve shifts rightward, and then what happens in the equilibrium? So here P1, so price of that particular commodity will increase, and then quantity also will be increased, right? So this is the changes, like E1 equilibrium point will be changing from E1 to E2, and this is how quantity of the particular commodity will increase from X1 to X1 to X2, and price also will be increasing from P1 to P2. What happens in the equilibrium when change in supply curve happens? Like say this is demand curve and here supply 1, so P here, again say commodity X, and then here Q, and suppose more supplying of that particular commodity in the market, so price P1 initially and X1 here initially. Now suppose more supply, so excess supply, that will create the downward pressure on the price. So if more supply in the market of that particular commodity and demand is keeping constant or the same, then equilibrium, market equilibrium will be moving downward, and as a result excess sort of commodity will be produced in the market, which will create the downward pressure on the price. So this is how equilibrium changes in the market. But similarly we can also have demand and supply, both are changing, and how equilibrium changes. So we're not getting much in the details, but then this is how it changes when tax is introduced or subsidies are introduced, and then how it happens in the in the market in case of demand and supply, and then how market will respond. So I'll stop here, and I have also used the 3 books that I have already mentioned in my previous class. Same books and selected chapters you can actually follow. More examples in case of public policy, how demand curve and supply curves are responding to each other. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you in my next class.